to take a few minutes and I want to talk about when God reinvents us. When God reinvents us. Jesus was always in the Gospels illustrating God's transformational power, his ability to change things. Before the first service, I was talking to a few of the families that came early, and I was asking them, I said, what are you going to do the rest of the day? And a couple of them just said they were going to do yard work. And when they said that, I said, describe that to me. And someone said, well, we need new bushes here, or we need this over there. And I looked at them, I said, man, you're obviously good at this. I said, I want to invite you to come over to my house and do the same thing. And they, were not as Christian as I thought they would be. But as a result of that, one of the things that became clear was that they're reinventing. They're putting bushes that hadn't been there. They're putting plants and they're putting trees and they're doing some things like that. Well, you have to understand God's in the reinventing business. Jesus was always transforming. He was changing, and he was changing lives. But what he periodically does is he pulls back the curtain and he gives us a glimpse of someone who may have been rigid in their ways. Now, I know you don't know anybody, but do you know anybody who knows somebody who is rigid in their ways? Any of you know somebody like that? Well, and if you're sitting next to them, just God bless them. But people that are just a little bit rigid in their way. But here's the thing about Jesus. He specializes in changing people who are rigid in their ways. And see, some of us, we know we're rigid in our ways. Maybe we tend to be the person who's a little bit critical, or maybe a little bit angry, or we hold a grudge a little bit too long. And as a result of that, we want to change. And the truth of the matter is, many of us have tried to change those things, but we've been unable to change. Why? Because meaningful and lasting change just doesn't happen without Jesus being a part of it. And I wished it was simple enough that you could just will yourself into it. But if will were enough, pretty well all of us would be perfect. But the truth is that we need God's help when it comes to change. So today, Jesus begins to give us an illustration of transformational change. And in Luke 19, verses 1 and 2, it says, Jesus entered and he passed through Jericho, and now, behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. Now, I don't want you to overlook that, because there's a lot of stories in the Bible that are very, very famous. And we all recall them, but we're not given the name of the individual. See, we know there was a Good Samaritan. We don't know the Good Samaritan's name. We know time and time again that there was a rich young ruler, but we don't know the rich young ruler's name. Jesus is going really deep when he gives us the name of the individual, and it says a man named Zacchaeus. It's not only that we're given his name, but we're given really the core pieces of information about his life, who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. So all this information begins to give us content that God thinks we need to know. He thinks we need to know this man's name. This isn't the rich young ruler. It's not the Good Samaritan. We don't know their names, but we know Zacchaeus' name. And God gives us the information. And the first thing that we know about him besides his name was that he was a tax collector. Now you have to recognize the implications of what that meant in the New Testament. See, if you were a tax collector, that meant that you were working for the Roman Empire. And if you were a Jewish person and you were working for the Roman Empire, that was one of the most vile things that you could possibly do. Because you sold yourself out as far as the Jewish people. You're now working for the people that oppress us. You're working for the people who have conquered us. You're working for the people who aren't allowing us the fullness of what we're supposed to be. And so Zacchaeus was considered a traitor. So by implication of his job, He had chosen an identity that he knew that that identity was going to be one that would be looked down upon. So we know that this particular individual is looked down upon by pretty well everyone in Israel except the Romans. But then we know that he was rich. He was wealthy. He was good at his job. He was good at what he did. Why? The tax collector, he would go into the businesses, he'd go into the families, he would begin to engage with them, he'd figure out what they had, and he would figure out how much of what they had he could get. And he always got more than the Romans required, because the Romans let you, if you were a tax collector, sort of build on top into whatever the taxes were, something for yourself. And he was very, very good. So much so that we know not only was he a tax collector, but it says he was a chief tax collector. Other tax collectors worked under him. So think of any pyramid scheme. He's not only getting a little of his, but he's getting a little of every other tax collector that is under him. And so his wealth is accumulating. He is created money. So what we know about Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus chose a job that is going to be a money maker. He is good at his job, and now he has other people making money, and he gets some of their money, and because of that, he's rich, he's wealthy. It's this last thing that really causes me a little consternation that Jesus threw in there, and it says, and he sought to see Jesus, but could not because he was of short stature. I don't believe that we should shame short people. I believe short shaming is just not something that is, and I've got to talk to Jesus when I get into heaven and say, what's this short shaming kind of thing? But he just had to point out he's a little bit short. But we don't use the word short in our society. We call them vertically challenged. People who are vertically challenged. But let me say, just because you're short doesn't mean that you're not athletic, because Zacchaeus was. Because he's going to climb a sycamore tree. So think of Ninja Warrior. He was the first one ever. He was the first ninja who just worked his way up that, obstacle and got on top of it. And so that's who Zacchaeus was. But everything that we're told about his identity up to now is going to center around money. He wanted money. He chose a job that would get him money. He did that job well, so he's making a lot of money. And now he's a chief tax collector, so he's not only making money, but he's got other people that are making money for him. Money defined him. It defined him. Now, here's one thing that you don't see. You don't see any other names other than Zacchaeus. Why is that? Because people were not on his scorecard. There was one thing on his scorecard. How much money do you have? Aren't you glad that there aren't people who live their life that way today? Aren't you glad that this is just a fictional story that people would say who don't believe the Bible of people 2,000 years ago? Except it wasn't fictional, and there's still 2,000 years later, people, the only thing on their scorecard is money. That's it, the dollars. In 1982, when Jenny and I started this church, Plano was so different. It was a bedroom community. There were no businesses here. You may have the Brahms that was over there, on Custer, but there was really not anything else. Everyone in Plano drove down to Dallas. That's where their jobs were. That's where everyone worked. But over a period of time, Plano began to change, and now you have Toyota, and you have Liberty Mutual, and you have all the businesses that are just literally 2.5 miles from here that make up the corporate center. All these headquarters. And so what you have is you have a different kind of person, not someone who's living out because they can't afford in and is driving in to work every day, but you have people that are atop of the echelon of whatever company they are. Sometimes I've looked at some of them and I said, man, you're doing so well. Describe to me how you let what you do well impact other people. And to watch them have no answer. Because they were just taught to do well, but do you know who they were taught to do well for? Them. And so well for them was the end of the game. I mean, that was a scorecard. There wasn't a back page to the scorecard. And I looked at them. And see, that's who Zacchaeus is. And those of you in business who understand and have read a little bit and watched a little bit of the movie, just think of the Wolf on Wall Street. Classical. That's who Zacchaeus would be. Think of the movie The Big Short, the book. Classic book. But it's about people who are geniuses. And they're genius at being greedy. But there's no back of character. So the greed is unlimited. So The Big Short, 2008. Knowing that the economy is about to collapse, but these people have gotten theirs, so they're not concerned with the economy collapsing. They're not one bit are the Wolf on Wall Street, working in the corporate centers, just pushing things to a level that there's just one thing, any lie goes, as long as we're doing all right. That's Zacchaeus. There's only one thing on the score sheet. So, stating the obvious, there's not a number two in his life. Jesus wanted you to know that. He not only wanted you to know he was a tax collector, but he was a chief tax collector. Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, was a tax collector, but he was not a chief tax collector. He never made it to this echelon of money making and wealth. But something happened to Zacchaeus, and one day he heard that Jesus was coming through. And like now, word begins to spread. He had heard about Jesus, and in Luke 19 and verse 3, it says he sought to see him. He wanted to see Jesus. This is the man everyone's talked about. This is the man everyone's telling a story about. I just want to see Jesus. But he couldn't get positioned where he could see him because nobody would let him. He's short. He needs to be at the front if he's going to see Jesus, but no one's letting him through. This isn't the individual that everyone's their friend. Hey, you can come up here. Why don't you stand in front of me? Nobody. See, nobody cared for Zacchaeus, and people say, well, why is it that no one cared? Because he didn't care for anyone. And I'll have people through the years that would come to me and say, nobody cares for me. And my question's always the same. Who have you cared for? Well, no one's there on my dark day. Who have you been with on their dark day? See, in life, very seldom do you ever receive what you haven't been. And if you haven't been caring to people, people don't care. If you haven't been there on their bad days, people usually aren't there on your bad days. And that's where he is. And so he saw it. And one of the things that we realize is there's always people in the way of you and Jesus. See, some people, I can't believe in Jesus because of what my family would say. Well, I can't believe in Jesus because of what my boyfriend would say, what my girlfriend would say. I can't believe in Jesus because, you know what, I've got to go do this every day, and that just doesn't fit. There's always people in between you and Jesus. Someone say amen. And you've got to decide if people being between you and Jesus is going to stop you from getting to Jesus. Because there's always going to be someone, well, you don't want to do that Jesus thing. Well, you know, that church thing, you know, that's just a little bit over the top. You know, that's for the weak-minded. That's for the really troubled people. They need that. But people who really are sophisticated, who know critical thinking, they don't need that. There's always people in the way of you and Jesus. And you've got to decide, are you going to work through the people to get to Jesus? And Zacchaeus thought, I'm going to do that. So what does he do? He begins to climb the tree. He says, well, I can't see from down here, so I'm going to go up there. And it says in verse 5, and Jesus came to the place and he looked up and saw. And this is one of the things that I love about our Lord and Savior, is that Jesus notices us regardless of what other people think of us. Jesus notices us regardless of what other people think of us. See, nobody else cared about him because he didn't care about anybody, but Jesus noticed him. Jesus noticed him. And he looks up there and he sees Zacchaeus, and he looks at Zacchaeus and he says, make haste and come down. Now, that in of itself is important. For some people, their struggle is they want Jesus, but they don't want to come down. They want what they've built, and then they want God's blessing. But if you're going to get God's blessing, you got to come down from things that you've built on. And so he's looking there and he says, you got to come down. And he utters these words, I must stay at your home. Understand those words. I must stay at your home. I must stay at your home. Zacchaeus, I must stay at your home. Now, the implications of what that meant in the Jewish context of faith is just amazing. And we could go through layers and layers of that to invite someone in your home and for someone to come into your home and the implications of that. In fact, you see the undercurrent, and it says, and when they saw it, what saw it? The crowd saw it, they all complained. People think, oh, you know, if Jesus is there, we got this peaceful, I love you, you love me, we're all a happy family. There are people who want Barney moments, they don't want Jesus moments. It says they all complained. They were all critical. Oh, I don't like the way this was said. I don't like the way this was done. Well, this shouldn't have been said that way. This shouldn't have been, he shouldn't be doing that. A lot of people love Jesus as long as Jesus will do it just the way they want it. And so what happened was they said, he's gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. He's going someplace he shouldn't go. And he's going with someone he shouldn't go to. And they're all complaining. Everyone's just complaining. But remember, Jesus is in the transformational business. Jesus is in the business of taking people that are fixed and rigid and changing their life. He's in the business of adjusting people. See, when God starts transforming people we don't like, some people will complain. And so there's cycles of behavior that are broken when God starts transforming you. And notice what it says in verse 8. Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord. Notice these words. I'll give half of all my goods to the poor. Here's a man whose whole life was based on accumulation. His whole scorecard was based on how much do you have, and do you have more, and can you get more, and how can you get more? And this man now is saying, I'll give half of it away. And then he went on and he says, if anyone wants to complain and said that I did something that shouldn't have been done, I'll restore whatever they say 4 times. See, the rigid pattern of who he was is being changed. And see, that's the nature of transformation. God changes things that no one thought. No one thought that Zacchaeus would ever move from the getting side to the giving side. They never thought that he could go from this column to this column. They never imagined that, and let alone would be a guy who would make things right. So what's happening? Jesus is changing his heart. Because remember, 1982, this is just a bedroom community. There was no wealth in Plano. There were hardworking people in Plano. The wealth was down in Highland Park. It was down in those areas. But now, there are people that work for these companies that are doing well. And I've talked to them and I've said, hey, how are you doing? And they say, well, I'm doing well. And I said, well, what about the economy? And they said, I'm doing very well. And then I'll ask them the question, well, how is your well doing for others? And they're just startled. There is no well for others. I'm doing well. And if there is others, it's controlled. Well, I do this if. But Jesus is changing their heart. Because he changed the heart of Zacchaeus. And then it changed what he thought. I can guarantee you, he never thought one time about someone being upset with how he was assessing their taxes. He never thought about that. But now he's thinking about that. Jesus is changing their head. And now he's literally giving. Jesus has changed his habits. So what happens is the cycle of behavior is being broken because Jesus is changing what's important, his heart. He's changing his head, how he thinks, and now it's showing up in his habits. But for most of us, we want to change our habits without changing our head or our heart. And you can't do that. Transformational moments start in our heart, and God's the only one that can truly change our heart. He goes in our hearts and he begins to change us, and he begins to nudge us, and he takes people who were dead in their trespasses and sins and he makes them alive. And I don't have that ability and you don't have that ability. But he's beginning to lift up all of the things and he's beginning to change. See, if you really want to see if someone's being changed, see if they give. Because it's usually the last thing to change. See, you change when you take Jesus home with you. I want to say it again. You change when you take Jesus home with you. See, when you take Jesus home with you, things start changing. You start changing when you take Jesus home. If I can remind some of you of that classic movie, Talladega Nights, and if you've never heard of it, you probably don't run in the right circles. But if I can remind you of Talladega Night and Ricky Bobby. Ricky Bobby is, all the gears aren't working, let's just put it, and that's a metaphor based on the movie. But there's this scene in there where he begins to pray, and as he begins to pray, and he says, I just want to thank little bitty baby Jesus. I want to thank little bitty baby Jesus, little bitty baby Jesus. I want to thank him for KFC. I want to thank him for Taco Bell. I want to thank him for my Doritos. And he starts going down this food list that people aren't supposed to. And he says, I want to thank. And then he starts thanking for his wife, and that's a whole different description thing. And he starts thinking there and everything. And finally he ends his prayer, and his wife looks at him and says, Ricky, you keep praying to this little bitty baby Jesus. You know that Jesus isn't a little bitty baby. He's grown up. He says, I don't want grown up Jesus. I want little baby Jesus. And as funny as that seems, I find that there are people who want Jesus as long as he's a certain way. And if he's a certain way, and if I could be real raw with you, I know people who want church Jesus. Well, I want church Jesus. You know, I'm going to go to church and I'm going to hear about Jesus and I'm going to sing a few songs and I'm going to act enthusiastic. I'm going to say amen. Well, some of you aren't there yet. But I'm going to say some things and I'm going to be a little bit Christian and everything. I want church Jesus. The problem is a lot of people who are rigid, they come and they experience church Jesus, but when they leave, they're as rigid as they've ever been. Church Jesus doesn't break patterns of your life. Home Jesus does. When you take Jesus home, Zacchaeus didn't change because he saw Jesus, because he heard Jesus. Zacchaeus changed because he took Jesus home. And when you take Jesus home, things start changing. And so things are different because you've got home Jesus. Instead of little bitty baby Jesus or blessing Jesus or, you know, Jesus on the dashboard Jesus. But when you have home Jesus, it starts changing you. It changes your heart, and it changes your head, and it changes your habits. And when you have home Jesus, he redefines you. Now, there's a phrase in here, and because most everyone here is from a Gentile faith, they don't catch it. It's Jesus expressing the magnitude of transformation. And the magnitude of transformation is when Jesus looks at him and he says, you know what, really? And he basically says this, heaven was in this place. And he says, you're a son of Abraham. Now, you've got to get something here. And I'm not being coy. Up to this moment, Zacchaeus had been called a son, but it wasn't a son of Abraham. He said, you're finally acting like a covenant child. You're finally doing it. Jesus said salvation has showed up in this house. It showed up in this house. Church Jesus is wonderful, but home Jesus is more wonderful. And when home Jesus is here, salvation happens. Cycles of behavior changed, and angry people don't become angry and all the time. And people who are just bound in something, their lives begin to change. Not because of Jesus being at church, but because you didn't leave Jesus at church. You took Jesus home. You took Jesus home. When you take Jesus home, things start changing. You know, it's interesting that last week was Bring Your Kids to Work week, which always mystified me. Because if you have a chance to be away from your kids, but all of a sudden, it's take your kid to work. It's take your kid to work. And I thought maybe we should have a week that we call it Take Jesus to Your Home Week. And see if we could get people to just take Jesus home with them for 1 week. What that might do. What that might do. Will you let Jesus come home with you?